This is the key to the worksheet on topics 1 through 3, and that was worksheet number 1. So number 1, you want to find the GCF of 16, 24, and 40. So remember GCF, greatest common factor. So what's the largest common factor that 16, 24, and 40 have in common? Okay, you want to find the largest because it says greatest. So what I would do there is I would look at 16, this is number 1, I would look at 16, 24, and 40. And what I would do is I would list the factors of each of those. Okay, so for example, the factors of 16 are 1 and 16, because 1 times 16, 16. So 1's a factor of 16, 16's a factor of 16. Then we could say 2 times 8, so 2 is a factor of 16, 8's a factor of 16. Then 4 times 4, but we only list 4 once. 4 is a factor of 16. So remember what I'm doing is this. 1 times 16 is 16. 2 times 8 is 16. 4 times 4 is 16. So all of these are factors. 1's a factor, 16's a factor, 2's a factor, 8's a factor, and so on. 4. Okay, and those are the only factors of 16. So then you do the same thing for 24. So the factors of 24, factors are, and you do the same thing. So 1 times 24 is 24. So 1's a factor and 24 is a factor. And then we continue on. 2 times 12 is 24. So 2 is a factor, 12 is a factor. Then we can say 3 times 8 is 24. So 3 is a factor, 8's a factor. Then we can say 4 times 6 is 24. 4 is a factor, 6 is a factor. And that should be it. Okay, so those are the only factors of 24. So those are the only numbers whose product is, the only whole numbers whose product is 24. Okay, so then we do the same thing with 40. So the factors of 40 are, and we do the same thing. 1 times 40 is 40. So 1's a factor of 40, 40's a factor of 40. 2 times 20 is 40. 2's a factor of 40, 20 is a factor of 40. Then we say 4 times 10 is 40. 4 is a factor of 40, and 10's a factor of 40. Then we can say 5 times 8 is 40. 5's a factor of 40, 8's a factor of 40. And let's see, I think that may be it. So that's all the factors of 40. Okay, so what you're going to do now is you're going to look at all these factors of 16, 24, and 40, and you're going to find the one that's the largest. So if you look, the largest that they have in common. All right, so you may see, well 16, but 16 is not listed here. So it looks like the largest that they have in common is 8. Now they have a lot of other common factors. I mean, 1's a factor of all of them, 2's a factor of all of them, but the largest that they have in common is 8. So the answer number 1 is 8. Okay, now when doing number 2, the way I would think about number 2 is this. So you're looking for the GCF of a variable expression. So you have 3x to the 4th and x squared. Now, one of the things you learned about the variables when you're trying to find the GCF involving variables is that the greatest common factor, so the factors they have in common. So if you look at the coefficients, this is 3, this is 1. So the GCF so far is easy. That's just 3. Okay, now, I'm sorry. Excuse me. That's just 1. Excuse me. We're talking about greatest common factor. So that's just 1. Then we look at the variable. So this is x to the 4th, this is x squared. You always choose the one with the smallest exponent. So we have 1 times x squared, so the answer is x squared. Okay, so the greatest common factor of 3 and 1 is 1, and the greatest common factor of x to the 4th and x squared is x squared. Okay, it's not x to the 4th. The reason it's not x to the 4th because there's not enough factors of x's here. There's only 2 factors of x here, and there's only 4 factors of x here. So you can only use 2 of them. So that's the largest they have in common. Okay, so the answer in number 2 is just x squared. Okay, and then you would do the same thing with this using these ideas. So the GCF, now notice that's a negative 8, but unless they tell you, see it says use a positive GCF. So we have 16, 24, and negative 8, and so the GCF of those three numbers, 16, 24, and negative 8, is 8. And then you look at the x's. Now remember, you have to have an x in all factors to include factors of x here. So I have one factor of x here. I have 2 here, x squared, 2 of them, and I have 1 here. So again, you can only use 1 of them. And then in terms of y's, I have 3 factors of y here, so your exponent tells you how many factors you have. I have 2 factors here and 1 here, so you got to use one of the smallest number of factors, so that's 1. So the GCF there is 8xy. Okay, now in number 4, it says factor out the GCF. So if you look at those two terms, 15a squared and negative 3a to the 4th, the GCF here is 3a squared. Okay, so now remember it says factor out the GCF, so you're going to say 3a squared times, and then times whatever will give you this back. So 3a squared times 5 gives you 15a squared, and then minus 3a squared times what will give you 3a to the 4th. Well, you already have that 3 right here, and then you have an a squared, so a squared times a squared is a to the 4th. So it'll be, I'm sorry, a squared here. So the answer is 3a squared times 5 minus a squared. Okay, so that's a squared. Okay, letter B. So again, you want to factor out the GCF. So if you look at there are 3 terms here. So if you look at the coefficients, this is a 3, this is a negative 15, and this is a 30. So the GCF, the greatest common factor of 3, negative 15, and 30 is 3. Then let's look at the variables. I have an R, an R, and an R. And only have one factor here, R to the first, one factor, R to the first, one factor, so I'm going to factor out one of them. Then the S, I have one factor of S here, I don't have any here, I don't have any here, so I cannot factor out any S's. So the GCF is just going to be 3R. And the same thing for T. This doesn't have any T's in it, so I cannot factor out a T from those 3 terms. And the same thing here, that's a U, but these don't have any of them, so I cannot factor out a U from those 3 terms. So the GCF is just 3R, but you got to factor out. It's because it says factor. It doesn't say find the GCF. It says factor each of the following. So the first thing you have to do is factor out the GCF. And so we get 3R. So 3R times S, 3R times S, uses distributive property, gives you 3RS. And then minus 3R times 5T, because 3 times negative 5 is a negative 15, and then R times T is RT, gives us negative 15 RT. And then plus 3 times 10 gives us 30, so that's a 10 here. And then I already took out an R, and so I'm left with the U. And so you can always check. 3 times 10 is 30, R times U is RU. All right. And so in the next one, so the GCF here, we have a 7, a negative 21, and a 35, so that's going to be a 7. We have 4 factors of x here. We have 3 here, and we have 2 here, so I can only factor out 2 of them. So that's your GCF. So then you're going to say 7x squared times, all right, so 7x squared times x squared gives us 7x to the 4th, because remember, you multiply like bases, you add exponents. X squared times x squared is x to the 4th. And then minus 7 times 3 is 21, and then x squared times x gives us x cubed, because x squared times x to the 1st, when you multiply like bases, you add exponents. 2 plus 1 is 3. And then plus 7 times 5, and that's all you need, because, see, this is an x squared, and all you had here was an x squared. So don't put any x here. You don't need any. There, you already factor out what you needed. So this x squared was your GCF and was part of your GCF. All right, so that's it. That's the answer there. Now number 5, all that was just to see if you knew how to factor out a negative coefficient. So here the GCF here, and you want to factor out the negative one, so it'll be a negative 4. So it'll be negative 4 times x, because negative 4 times x is negative 4x. Now you got to be careful here. A negative 4 times a negative 2 gives us a positive 8. So that's what you have to put there. Okay, now in each of these three here, you had to factor by grouping. So let me go ahead and actually do this part here. So this is going to be 6a. So in 6a, you had w cubed minus 4w squared plus 4w minus 16. So the first thing you need to do is notice that there are 4 terms here. So whenever you have 4 terms, you want to try and do this by grouping. Now the first thing you should have done that you learned in a lesson was to see if these 4 terms has a GCF other than 1. And then it doesn't, because here there's only 3 factors of W. There's 2 factors here, 1 factor here, and there are none here. So you can't factor out any W's. And then the coefficients, that's a 1, that's a negative 4, that's a 4, and that's a negative 16. So, well, this is a constant, negative 16. And so the GCF is 1. So other than 1, you can't factor out anything else. So now what you're going to do is we're going to try grouping the first 2 and the last 2. In the first 2, and you may need to kind of cover this part here if you have to. So in other words, so do something like this if you need to. So from this group, it looks like the GCF is w squared. So I'm going to go ahead and factor out a w squared. So I get w squared times, and then w squared times w is w cubed, and then w squared times a negative 4 will give me negative w squared. Then you learned also that for the second group, you're going to factor out a positive coefficient or a positive GCF. And in this case, the GCF is going to be 4. So plus 4, and then you get 4 times w is 4w minus, and then 4 times 4 is a negative 16. Well, 4 times a negative 4 is a negative 16. Now at this point, if this is factored by grouping according to the first group and the second group, then what you see in those parentheses should be the same. Since they're the same, you're going to factor out the w minus 4. So when I factor out a w minus 4, what you have left is w squared in parentheses plus, and then factor out a w minus 4, you're left with 4. And so that's your answer. Okay, you cannot factor that any further because that's the sum of 2 squares. You learned that the sum of 2 squares later on cannot be factored. All right, so that's all you had to do. All right, B, you have this. You have x cubed plus 5x squared minus 8x minus 40. All right, so again, do the same thing. So let's group the first 2 and the last 2. But first of all, notice that the GCF of those 4 terms is 1. Okay, so from the first group, it looks like I can factor out an x squared, because that's a 1, that's a 5, so the GCF of 1 and 5 is 1. And you have 3 factors of x here, 2 factors of x here, so you're going to factor out 2 of them. And x squared times x gives me x cubed plus, and then x squared times 5 gives me 5x squared. Just using distributive property gives you this back. Now, over here, remember you're going to factor out a negative GCF now. Always factor out that negative middle sign. Always factor out that middle sign. So in this case, it's negative. So you're going to factor out a negative 8 here, because the GCF here is 8. And so you're going to factor out negative 8. So negative 8 times x gives us negative 8x. And then plus a negative 8 times a positive 5 gives us a negative 40. And then notice that these two are the same. So now that means I can factor out an x plus 5. And so when I factor out an x plus 5, you're taking this out of this term, you're left with x squared. And then you're taking out an x plus 5 out of this term, and you're left with a minus 8. And that's your answer. So x plus 5 times x minus 8. And then finally, number C, or letter C, you have x squared minus 3x plus 9. And so again, notice the GCF of those 4 terms is 1. So you can group the first 2, group the last 2. From the first group, I can factor out an x. That's your GCF of the first group. So I get x times x is x squared, and then minus x times a negative 3 is a negative 3x. And again, factor out that middle sign. So we have negative, in this case, 3. And so negative 3 times negative 3 times x is a negative 3x. And then a negative 3 times a negative 3 is a positive 9. Again, notice these two are the same. And so that means now you can factor out an x minus 3. And then when you factor out an x minus 3 from this part here, you're left with x in parentheses because these are factors, minus, and then here the same thing. And then notice those two factors are the same. So if you want to, you can also say x minus 3 squared. All right, so that is, so the answer for 6a, I'm going to go ahead and write it out. So the answer for 6a is w minus 4 times w squared plus 4, and then x plus 5 times x squared minus 8, and then finally x minus 3 times x minus 3. Okay, so that is the key to the worksheet on topics 1 through 3.